Folks, within this story of this incredible island of Manhattan, which I do believe is our lost American history, what I find nearly as fascinating is the iconic names such as Hudson, Block, Minuit, Stuyvesant, Hamilton, and Morgan, is the critical cadre of gifted souls who masterfully lay down this history for us to examine. A small handful of historical authors touched by that hallowed knack for illustrating the lives of these figures whose tenacity and character quite often serve as the very bricks and mortar of the society in which we find ourselves living today. And so I'm greatly honored to have the privilege of introducing you to a guest who crafts such illustrations as deftly as anyone among us. Having already tackled giants such as Benjamin Franklin, John Jacob Astor, Teddy Roosevelt, J.P. Morgan, and Ronald Reagan, this prolific author now unveils for us a focused interplay between two of our other icons, transatlantic pioneer Charles Lindbergh and our 32nd president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. An interplay that tells of the precarious events that lead us into the Second World War, as told through a dialogue that in and of itself becomes as educating as it is disturbingly timely. The book is America First, Roosevelt vs. Lindbergh in the Shadow of War, and my guest is the brilliant biographer H.W. Brands. Welcome, Meneer.
Very nice to be with you, and thank you for that very kind and flattering introduction. I need to get you to do all of my intros.
I'd be happy to. It's true, and anybody who knows your work will agree with me, and anybody who doesn't is going to find out as soon as they open up one of your books. I really appreciate you taking the time to join me. My focus is, as I said, I really focus on the history of Manhattan from 1609 to 1909, because as I've said, I do view it as very much of our lost American history, because the events that emanate from Manhattan Island during that period, more than any other place that I can think of, would come to define the society in which we live today. And of course, your book focuses mostly on events between like 1939 and 1941.
Yeah.
But I want to point out something you say about Charles Lindbergh towards the end of the book. You're sort of wrapping up. I think this is in your epilogue. He resented the city. He resented cities and the complexities of industrial life. He longed to escape to the countryside and implicitly to the past. As his own life grew more complicated, the attraction of earlier, simpler times grew stronger. Your book, for me, is very much a story about America. It's a very real and a very poignant story, a very important one, I think. Did I read it correctly?
Yeah, I think you did. I'm glad I got that point across, because Lindbergh is a really pivotal character. In some ways, he's the most modern individual of his time. He's the guy who flew across the Atlantic. He was at the cutting edge of technology. Nobody knew more about aeronautical engineering and everything that required to put a plane in the air, keep a plane in the air, than Charles Lindbergh did. But his vision was not of the future. He was a backward-looking person. In fact, the thing he liked most about flying was not the speed, not the thrill, but the fact that as America, so Americans come from Europe, they come from various other places, and they conquer this continent, and by some standards, they despoil the continent, but at the same time, they realize that they're losing something. And so almost as soon as the first sort of frontier develops in America, there's a feeling that, that the unspoiled wilderness, that's the best of America. And I should add that in the 1890s, this caused a real crisis of American confidence when it became apparent there wasn't any frontier left. There wasn't any empty land left. From the early 1600s, with the first colonies on the East Coast, until the middle of the 1800s, there was always this notion. It was more prospective than actually acted upon, that if things get bad here, wherever here is, we can move west and start over again. But by the 1890s, there's no place to move to in America. Now, Americans kind of finesse this, say, well, okay, our future is now overseas, so we'll find new places to go, but it was a very different kind of thing. So yes, Lindbergh lived in the early part of the first 2/3 of the 20th century, but his soul was really back in the 19th century
Yeah, he's
sometime.
like a 19th century guy.
Yeah,
And the whole idea is we're going forward here. That's the
yeah,
idea. And it's
yeah,
crazy that we're like we view in the context of this book, we view him as like the curmudgeon, like, oh, come on, buddy. We got a war to fight. Let's go, And he's like, no,
yeah.
I don't want to get into World War II.
Well, and so this is it's kind of it's an interesting part of the Lindbergh story. It complicates a bit the argument, the debate that he's having with Franklin Roosevelt, because this debate is over whether the United States, narrowly speaking, should the United States get more deeply involved in the war that's going on in Europe. And then an aspect of that is that, will that mean we also get involved in the war that's going on in Asia? But broaden the lens just a little bit. And what Roosevelt is saying is that America needs to step forward and take world leadership. So Roosevelt has this very expansive view of what America's future should be. And Lindbergh says, no, 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 we don't want to do that. We have 150 years of our national history going back to the 1770s and 1780s, and it's always served us very well to keep focus on our own part of the world. Good heavens, it's a big enough part of the world. It's half of North America, and we've essentially got the Western Hemisphere to ourselves. And he says, don't mess this up by launching these crusades into Europe and into Asia, because he said, if we do this, we're never going to get out of it. We will always be stuck having to fight the world's battles.
They both had really good points, didn't they?
They did. They did. And this is kind of the ironic thing. And so Lindbergh was an intelligent guy, and he could sort of see how things were playing out. He also bitterly despised Franklin Roosevelt because he thought that Roosevelt was using this crisis in Europe to extend his political career beyond what it should have been. Those were the days when there was a de facto rule against third terms for American presidents. And Roosevelt should have, at his second term was going to run out at the end of 1940, and he'd be gone and somebody would replace him. But Roosevelt, well, like some other presidents, didn't know what he was going to do with himself if he left office. And you don't become president of the United States without developing a fairly healthy ego. And he was pretty sure that he could handle this international crisis better than anybody else could. And quite possibly he was right about that. But Lindbergh thought that he is using this as an excuse to extend his term in office. And so every time Roosevelt said, this isn't taking us closer to war, I guess I should actually back up a little bit and set this up. As late as 1935, just 4 years before the war in Europe breaks out, Americans are overwhelmingly opposed to getting involved in another war. And I say another war because they have memories of World War I. And they went into World War I with great eagerness, and they soon became disillusioned by the way it turned out. So there was this attitude, almost universal in America, that we made a mistake the first time, and we better not make that same mistake again. And Congress went so far in 1935 to pass a law saying that if war breaks out, the United States will be neutral. The United States will not join one side or the other. And basically handcuffed the president, so the president couldn't do what Woodrow Wilson had done in World War I, sort of gradually move the United States toward war. But that's exactly what Franklin Roosevelt did. He had to do it carefully, and he succeeded. Now, with the help of events overseas, with the help of bad guys like Hitler, in changing Americans' minds. And this is what Lindbergh was fighting against. He said, don't go down that road. He didn't trust Roosevelt, but he also didn't trust Roosevelt's vision of the world. And he predicted, if we let Roosevelt get elected a third time, he'll get elected a fourth time. He'll be president till the day he dies, which is exactly what happened.
I wasn't aware that the two-term limit was not in place at this point. Call me ignorant, but I looked up the 22nd Amendment reading your book. I'm like, wait a minute. I thought they couldn't. And then I said, oh my God, And then I thought they had lifted the restriction during World War II because so that FDR, because we were in wartime. But no, there was no, until FDR was gone, there
Yeah.
was no restriction. You could theoretically be president
You
indefinitely.
could theoretically, but the thing is, George Washington had stepped down after
Yeah,
2 terms. And so for somebody to say, I'm going to take 3 terms, so you think you're better than George Washington?
right.
And no president was willing to make that statement before Roosevelt. And he claimed that it's only under the duress of war. Maybe so, but he certainly took the opportunity. And you mentioned the 22nd Amendment. Well, it was passed to make sure there wouldn't be any more
Didn't
Franklin
happen
Roosevelt.
again. Yeah, and they even put a stipulation in there that would eliminate the Teddy Roosevelt situation where
Right.
he took over within the first year, and they said, okay, if you take over and you do more than 2 years of any given term,
That's it.
that counts as
Yeah.
a term too.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's amazing what you learn when you read.
Yeah.
But okay, I'm a big fan of FDR. I always have been. I became less of a fan of him reading this book. Many things that I don't like, I learned from you in this book about FDR. And I think Lindbergh had good reason to not trust him. He wasn't entirely truthful to the people, especially during the 1940 campaign.
Yeah.
When he said, he told them, I'm not going to send your kids to war. He said it over and over again. I'm not going to send your kids to war. I'm not going to send your kids to war. And then he says to his son, Jimmy, his oldest son, James, you tell about this. Jimmy, I knew we were going to war. This is right after he's elected. Jimmy, I knew we were going to war. I was sure there was no way out of it. I just had to delay until there was no way out of it. I mean, people say, history repeats itself, and it could be viewed as a cliche to some extent or overused a little bit. But in this situation, this book rattled me because I got 2 young adult sons and a young adult daughter, and the realities of war coming down resonate with me. I mean, as they do with everybody, but I really pay attention to it. It was scary to me, the things I read in this book and how similar they are to many of the things that we see going on right now.
Yeah. So in writing the book, I'm not trying to make you think less of Franklin Roosevelt or more of Franklin Roosevelt either way, but I want to show you what Roosevelt did. And setting this book up as essentially a debate between these 2 guys allows me, each one can cast the most dirt at the other. And so each one alleges the worst in the other. And you can sort of see how things turn out. But I'll say this, that many people many people perhaps should take issue with the way that Roosevelt got to the result he wanted to get to, because he clearly lied about things. He certainly passed things in a misleading perspective. He kept saying that by giving aid to Britain, it will actually decrease the chances that Americans will have to go to war because the British will defeat the Germans by themselves. Well, that was a pipe dream, but Roosevelt understood. Roosevelt, long before he admitted it, even to his son Jimmy, he was convinced that the United States not only would have to go to war, but the United States ought to go to war, because Roosevelt believed that the United States ought to take the lead in global affairs. Now, if he had said this in public, if he hadn't even said it immediately after Pearl Harbor, people would have said, what do you think you're doing? We don't want to do this. Roosevelt understood the American psyche, the American mindset. And he realized, first of all, that Americans are going to have to be led carefully down this path. And this is the part that Lindbergh didn't get. He didn't understand the American psychology. He thought that more people had the mindset that he had, that we had talked about a few moments ago, that were sort of looking backwards. But what Roosevelt did was he He flattered Americans to think the world needs us. We are the greatest people on earth. We will save the world. And when Lindbergh heard that, he said, that's horrible. We shouldn't be saving the world. We should just concentrate on making America itself the best place it can be. But Americans were entranced by this idea. And I will add that Americans still are pretty entranced by this idea. Since Pearl Harbor, which really ultimately, spoiler alert, Roosevelt wins the debate. The United States goes into World War II.
The case is sort of made for him, right?
Well, that's it. That's it. And the way World War II unfolds and the way it turns out makes it seem to many people who have the same kind of reservations about Roosevelt that you expressed just a few moments ago, that, boy, he wasn't telling the truth and he was doing it by kind of shady means. Yeah, but in this case, the end justified pretty much anything because Hitler was so bad and somebody had to stop him. Yeah. And so Americans still look on World War II as the good war. This is the model of wars for America. We don't rush into the war. We get attacked first, then we go all out. And in a relatively short space of time, 3.5, barely 4 years, we win. We go all out, we win. Our enemies, they unconditionally surrender. And that's that. Well, the thing is, in order to take that point of view, you have to kind of airbrush out a few things. Like World War II was the most destructive, the most murderous war in the history of the world. Somewhere between 40 and 60 million people died in this war. So you're going to call this a good war? And then to get more specific, this is a war when the United States became the only country on earth ever to use nuclear weapons. And in 2 flashes, 150,000 civilians get killed. I'm not criticizing this, but this is this thing that Americans take as the model. And so another thing that Lindbergh predicted was, okay, we get into this war and maybe we defeat Germany, but that's not going to end all the problems in Europe because now we're fighting on the side of the Soviet Union. And so, one tyrant is defeated in the war, but another tyrant, Stalin, is entrenched. And Soviet control over Europe was larger and much longer lasting than German control of Europe. So the outcome of World War II, this good war for Americans, it wasn't all that great. But there's this, it's a kind of paradoxical thing that happens. The more you invest in something, the more you're inclined to think well of it. The very fact that hundreds of thousands of Americans died in World War II made it more difficult to criticize World War II when it was all over. Because if you do, then you're saying, oh my gosh, all those lives have been lost in vain. And nobody wants to be in the position to do that.
Totally. While I have some criticism of FDR after reading this book particularly, I'm not doubting his action. They had to go. And even well before Pearl Harbor, he had the French premier, and this is back in like June 1940, in his ear saying, look, France is probably going to go down. Just be aware, if and when we go down, be sure that we did everything we could to fight in the name of liberty. Meanwhile, at the same time, Churchill's telling him, we may be the last stand on earth fighting this force. So that's a lot to have on your conscience, that pretty much the fate of the free world is in your hands.
Yeah. Now, it gets complicated by the fact that when the leaders of France, Churchill, the leader of Britain, are saying, you got to come to the defense of liberty, you got to come to the defense of democracy. Well, yeah, but bear in mind that the French had this empire that wasn't at all democratic. They controlled half of Africa, And there was no democracy there. They controlled Southeast Asia. There was no democracy there. So bailing out France would be bailing out France's undemocratic control over this great empire, and even more with Britain. And so Churchill could say, you know, we are the home of self-government in Britain. Yeah, but what about in India? What about in Southern Africa? What about all these other places? So, and Roosevelt, of course, was sophisticated enough to understand that this was involved. And so there is often this idea that Roosevelt and Churchill became best buddies as allies during World War II. And they certainly did develop a kind of affection for each other, but neither one kidded the other. So Roosevelt understood that Churchill had the interests of Britain and the British Empire in mind, not the interests of the United States. And Churchill understood that Roosevelt was not doing this for the welfare of the British Empire. He was doing it for the welfare of the United States. So there's this interesting dynamic that develops in all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I also, aside from the harrowing nature of this subject matter, something else that I love about historical stories, and it definitely comes up a lot in your work, is when special guests appear, sort of special, unexpected guests. And in this case, Henry Ford, Joseph Kennedy, and Churchill, who I love, you know. And they add to the texture so much. Was that entirely intended, or did that sort of arise in the course of your research in this?
So I decided early on that this book was going to be told primarily from the perspective of Roosevelt and Lindbergh. These are going to be my two protagonists. And it's set up essentially as a debate that goes on for 2.5 years, from 2.25 years, from the outbreak of war in Europe in the autumn of 1939 to Pearl Harbor in 1941. So that's kind of the backbone of the story. But I can't give this over entirely to these two guys alone, if only because I need to give impressions of what those two men were like to people who knew them. Now, in my general approach to writing history, I rely as much as I reasonably can on the words of people who were actually there, who saw what was happening, who took part in what was happening. Because to me, I mean, I remember this from almost my first exposure to history, that I was always much more entranced by a story told by somebody who was there, rather than a historian kind of weighing in from far away and decades later. And I remember reading old letters and diaries and journals and things like that. This is what I like. And so my two protagonists, Lindbergh and Roosevelt, they speak a lot in this book. But I also have to give the reader a sense of, so what kind of guy was Franklin Roosevelt? How did he seem? And instead of just me saying, well, he seemed a little bit shady at times, so I introduced the reader to James Farley, who was Roosevelt's postmaster general. And Roosevelt had led Farley to believe that after 2 terms were up, Roosevelt was going to tap Farley to get the Democratic nomination, be the next president of the United States. And so Farley's all in with Roosevelt until it becomes clear toward the end of the second term that Roosevelt's not leaving. And Farley feels that he's really been used. He's given the best years of his life to Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt just kind of tosses him aside.
And by the way, I don't think he was the only one, right?
No, not at all. I mean,
there was a lot of people in 6 or 12, 15
Roosevelt's
years,
vice
right?
president, John Nance Garner, same thing. So Roosevelt's telling Garner, you're the next one. He's telling Farley, you're the next one. And then it comes to understand, there's not going to be a next one because I'm going to stay president. And so both of them, they become very disillusioned. And you mentioned Joseph Kennedy. Okay, so Kennedy is a really interesting character in his own right, because he's this very successful money man on Wall Street. And then Roosevelt taps him to be first chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which seemed really odd. Somebody, like getting the fox to guard the hen house or something like that. But he was also very well connected, and he allowed me to kind of introduce what's going on in Britain, because I have to figure out how to describe what's happening in all these places. My book isn't simply people talking. It's also, people who are telling the story of what's going on in the world, because the background of all this is all the world's going to war. And so how do we deal with that? So I bring in these other characters. Of course, Churchill's a great one, because Churchill is just a wonderful figure on his own. And he also, he realizes early on that he needs Roosevelt. So as soon as he becomes prime minister, he starts cultivating Roosevelt. And he knows that, so they both at one time were what amounted to their country's Navy secretary. I mean, Roosevelt was the assistant Navy secretary, and Churchill was what they called the first Lord of the Admiralty. And so they talk to each other as old Navy guys.
Right.
Now, they've never really been in the Navy and gone to sea that way, but they like to think of it. And so Churchill is always, I mean, you mentioned Churchill telling Roosevelt that, we might not be around unless you give us this aid. Well, yeah, but Roosevelt understood that Churchill's going to put his situation and Britain's situation in the most dire light possible to basically put Roosevelt over this barrel where you have to do something. And so Roosevelt's always sort of mentally discounting what Churchill says a little bit, because Churchill says a lot for dramatic effect. So these characters who they can contribute to my story, it's almost like, in a lot of novels or in movies, there will be this, the best friend of the protagonist, because the best friend is the person that the protagonist speaks to, so you get inside the head of the main character. Well, Churchill plays some of that role for Roosevelt, because Roosevelt is writing these secret letters back and forth with Churchill. And he's telling Churchill stuff, and 90% of what he says is true. But again, Roosevelt is quite devious, and he's going to spin things the way he wants Churchill to see it. So through all of this, you got to figure out, well, who's telling the truth here? I mean, there's a germ of truth in all of this, but each person is telling it from the angle that's going to most benefit their position in their country.
Yeah, these stories are complicated, aren't they?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So in fact, if there's a single lesson to be drawn from history, is that it's complicated. And it's not just history that's complicated, life is complicated. Mm-hmm. There is a strong temptation for people to sort of look back in history and try to draw out the lesson of history as though there's a single lesson and it's relatively straightforward. So what does history tell us about this, that, or the other thing? Well, history tells us a lot of stuff, and it never tells us exactly what's going to happen. And the reason for this is that things that are going on today, the things that we're interested in knowing where it's leading, well, it's like stuff that happened in the past, but it's not identical to stuff that happened in the past. So you never know until it happens whether the similarities or the differences are more important. So there is perhaps one thing that you can learn from history, and that is, well, I like to say that history is the best way to understand human nature, to figure out all the things that humans do. I sometimes call history, it's a kind of applied philosophy. And the basic question is, what does it mean to be human? And, in our daily lives, we interact with our friends and we see how people work and we develop this sense of human nature. One of the great advantages of reading history or writing history is that we get to know a lot more people. I've never met anybody exactly like Winston Churchill or Franklin Roosevelt, but these are very instructive kinds of individuals to look at. And so I can look at Franklin Roosevelt and I can say that Roosevelt was devious. He was willing to shade the truth. He had his own interests in mind, but at the same time, he was one of the most important world leaders of the 20th century, and his influence was very largely for the good. I'm not going to claim it was 100% for the good, but nobody ever is. But Roosevelt, on balance, did really wonderful things for the world. So what kind of person is able to pull that off? If Roosevelt had been more straightforward, if Roosevelt had adopted a code of morality that you would expect in a friend, he wouldn't have been the leader he became, because he recognized. So he thought it was necessary for America, for the world, that he be president after 1940. Okay, so he's able to say, thanks, Jim Farley, you're out of here. Thanks, Jack Garner, you're out of here. You wouldn't want a friend to do that to you. But sometimes a president has to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, and his son James had something to say about that later as well, where he said he thinks his father really liked being president and didn't want to walk away from it, that he didn't know what he would do with himself.
And so Roosevelt, of course, Franklin Roosevelt was the second Roosevelt to be president of the United States. Theodore Roosevelt was his fifth cousin and also his uncle by marriage. And Theodore Roosevelt became Franklin Roosevelt's model for what a president does, how to become president, just sort of how to be president. And anybody who watched Theodore Roosevelt closely realized that Theodore Roosevelt was absolutely lost after the presidency. He didn't know what to do with himself. And he goes off to Africa on a safari. He comes back. He busts up the Republican Party because he gets talked into running again, and that doesn't work. And so he joins a third party. And so Franklin Roosevelt realized, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself, when I retire. So I don't think I'm going to retire. See if I can work that out. As I said before,
start a new party, maybe.
Yeah, you don't get to be president of the United States unless you think pretty highly of yourself.
Yeah, agreed. What do you want people to know about this book and why it's important to you?
So the way I have been putting it is in focusing on the election campaign of 1940, where these issues come out. That was one of the most important elections in American history for this question of what is America's role in the world. Until 1940, most Americans said, we don't want a world role. We'll settle for a North American role. We just want America to be the best it can be here. We don't have any grand designs, no great desire to remake Europe, to remake Asia, to make the world in our image to be a police power around the world. No, we don't want that. Roosevelt had an opposite view. And during the election of 1940, he didn't state quite openly that's what he wanted, but that's where he was going. And so America, by the time the US got into World War II, had made this decision, we want to be the leader of the world. And Americans have largely accepted that for the 84 years from 1940 until now. But in the last 10 years, there's been a rethinking of this. There were momentary rethinkings after Vietnam, but that didn't last. And so Donald Trump, the reason I call the book America First is that was both the name of the committee that Lindbergh spoke for, opposing American intervention in World War II. And it's also the name that was revived by Donald Trump for his 2016 campaign. And in that campaign and during his presidency, and since his presidency, Donald Trump has really reopened the debate of what America's role in the world is. So part of Roosevelt's thinking was we need alliances. We need to support our allies. We will make commitments and we will stand by our commitments. Donald Trump has said, well, it's time to rethink things like NATO and America's commitments. And Roosevelt and the people who followed him in the same vein said, if there's trouble around the world, the United States needs to step in and see that it doesn't get out of hand. And Joe Biden, the current president, has led the United States deeply into the war in Ukraine. Not American troops on the ground yet, but a clear American commitment to Ukraine. And Donald Trump has said, no, we don't want to do that. And this is really the first time, I would argue, and I would say this election campaign, where we have now it's Kamala Harris rather than Joe Biden, but the Democrats are still saying that the United States needs to commit to being a world leader. And Donald Trump is saying maybe not. And so voters, for really the first time since 1940, are having a chance to say, well, what do we want out of all of this? And knowing what they know about Donald Trump's worldview, if Donald Trump gets elected, then it will look as though what I sort of call the Roosevelt consensus, that the United States needs to be this world leader, we're going to see a reversal of that, or at least a clear revision of it. So, I mean, that's what prompted me to write the book now. So the lesson here, the takeaway is we in America live in a democracy, and we have both the opportunity and the obligation to decide what this country should be doing in the world. And the last time, as I say, before this year, go back to 1940, that's really the last time before now that American voters got to weigh in on this issue. And I think it's important in a democracy for voters to weigh in on these big issues every so often. And we simply can't take it for granted that because the United States has been the leader of the world since 1940 until now, that we ought to continue to do it. Maybe we should, of course, but we ought to hear the arguments against. So I think that this is a case where this 1940 election, it can inform the debate of the 2024 election. By the way, I'll just add that the book originally was going to be published sort of later in this year, along in November. But my publisher and I decided, this is probably going to be, this basic question is going to be a big issue in the election campaign. So let's move it forward, which is why the book is being published in September.
Well, I think you made an astute decision. Like I say, the issues are remarkably timely, and I think you've done a magnificent job. Well, Professor Brands, I have a great respect for anyone who makes a living with the written word, and for someone who can do it and make history come alive with those words, which you do magnificently with every outing. I think that is not only worthy, but a truly noble cause. You and I are officially co-conspirators in the sacred pursuit of making history cool. And I say to you once again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on with us here and discuss your new book. It's brilliant, just like its author, and we look forward to continuing to follow your career every step of the way. The book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War, a fascinating account of the events that led to our entry into World War II, the latest of a growing list of extraordinary historical works by this gentleman, H.W. Brands. Its official release is September 24th, and you can get it at penguinrandomhouse.com and at all major booksellers. Get it, folks. It's remarkable, a remarkable study in our American journey, and this man is one of the finest chroniclers of that journey among us today. Thank you so much, sir.
Delighted to talk to you.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
I will, and you.
Thank you.
Best of luck with the launch.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. You can watch or listen to this podcast on YouTube. History is Cool on YouTube. History is Cool on YouTube. And on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Island Voices. Island Voices on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Island Voices is a production of Chance Kelly, Inc. and may not be reproduced or re-exhibited in any manner, in whole or in part, without authorization. Thank you.